In the previous film of our documentary series, we talked about how historical documents, literary works, ancient artifacts, and works of art were falsified. Medieval reformers erased the true past of humanity from the pages of history, replacing it with fiction and half-truths. This was a long process that lasted more than 1 century. However, it was not enough to provide only written documents to introduce a new history into the consciousness of the people. It was necessary to provide material evidence of the new historical version. And following the editing and forgery of written documents, the process of falsifying monuments of material culture began. Sometimes the process of falsifying historical monuments was carried out on a state level, and sometimes it was the work of a small group of people. Some of them were eager for money, some for fame, and some were simply carrying out a specific order. Since the 16th century, a huge number of all kinds of forgeries have been produced. Unfortunately, this process is not yet over and continues to this day. This film will tell about 3 high-profile stories of falsification of historical monuments. History is all around us. Any building, any object that has survived to our present day has its own historical value. And the older these objects are, the more they attract people's attention. That is why, among so-called antiquities, there are many fakes. Today it is well known that there are counterfeit paintings, jewelry, coins, and seals. Numerous fake documents and chronicles have been discovered. But not everyone knows that among the famous architectural and archaeological monuments, there are also fakes. Some of them have even been declared World Heritage Sites. Because the grander the forgery, the easier it is to convince people of its authenticity. For several centuries now, most people have learned about the great Troy from Homer's Iliad. The poem is called Iliad because the Greeks called this city Ilion. The Trojan War is believed to have taken place in the 13th century BC. Historians claim that Homer was not a contemporary of the Trojan War, but lived 700 years later. At the same time, he wrote his poems supposedly based on oral traditions and songs of wandering minstrels. There are no written documents or historical records that have survived about Troy and the legendary Trojan War. Moreover, traditional historians claim that Homer was blind. Therefore, he could not have written his poems himself. He could only dictate them to someone else. But during his lifetime, no one sought to perpetuate these works. Over the centuries, they were supposedly passed down through oral tradition and were only written down several hundreds of years after the poet's death. It is not surprising that most scholars and educated people until the end of the 19th century perceived Homer's poem only as an epic and Troy itself as a mythical city. But at the end of the 19th century, many people's attitudes changed because the German amateur archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann supposedly managed to find the ruins of Homer's Iliad. Schliemann's biography romantically describes how the young Heinrich from childhood dreamed of finding the legendary Troy. Growing up, Schliemann became a successful millionaire businessman and could afford such a costly enterprise as searching for a lost city. Let's take a closer look at the details of the search for Troy. There is a widespread myth that Schliemann searched for Troy holding a copy of Homer's work, relying solely on the text of the Iliad. However, this is not the case. Schliemann arrived in Turkey following in someone else's footsteps, primarily those of the French scholar Choiseul-Gouffier, who made several expeditions to the northwestern Antalya province in Turkey in the 18th century. The Frenchman published a description of this area and claimed that Troy was located approximately 10 kilometers from the Hisarlik Hill. In 1822, Scottish journalist Charles Maclaren published an article claiming that the Hisarlik Hill was the ancient Troy. The first excavations of the hill were conducted by an Englishman named Frank Calvert in the 1820s. However, Calvert ran out of funds before he could complete his work. Schliemann, on the other hand, had the resources to finish the job. Schliemann wrote, "After having twice carefully studied the entire plain of Troy, I now agree wholeheartedly with Calvert's conviction that the plateau at Hisarlik is the site of the Pergamos of Troy." Why did scholars start searching for ancient Troy specifically here? In the 18th-19th centuries, there were still medieval records that the ancient Troy was located within the territory of the Ottoman Empire. But the fact is that Turkey is densely covered with the ruins of ancient settlements and military fortifications. Almost anywhere, one can find fragments of ancient buildings. And it is completely incomprehensible why the remains of a settlement found on Hisarlik Hill were declared as ancient Troy with such enthusiasm. After all, there was nothing Homeric there. When the ruins were cleared of the earth, it turned out that the size of the settlement was only 120 by 120 meters. It's like 2 football fields. For anyone who has read Homer's poem, it's entirely obvious that the territory of the city depicted by the poet was much larger. It was then decided to declare that Troy consists of several archaeological layers. Allegedly, the very first settlement was located on such a small piece of land. And then the city gradually grew, and Troy, during the time of the famous Trojan War, occupied supposedly 20,000 square meters. But even in such a space, more than 500 people could hardly live at the same time. After all, in addition to dwellings and internal roads, there had to be temples, warehouses, and spaces for livestock somewhere. Homer, describing the siege of Troy, which lasted for 10 years, tells us that over 1,000 Greek ships arrived to storm the city. This means that the number of warriors besieging Troy was about 30,000. If this small fortress was really Troy, then it is obvious that under the pressure of such an impressive Greek army, the Trojans would not have held out for even a week. It is likely that historians and archaeologists understood that the size of the settlement, even at 20,000 square meters, did not correspond to the description of Homeric Troy. Therefore, the dimensions have been increased. In 2003, German archaeologist Manfred Korfmann, who is now considered the most authoritative expert on Troy, stated that he was able to establish the authentic size of the city. According to him, the area of the presumed Troy is 13 times larger than commonly thought. That is, it is not 20,000 square meters, but 217,000. Starting in 1988, Korfmann conducted excavations here for 15 years, which cost €3 million. However, despite the fact that thanks to the efforts of German archaeologists and their sponsors, this settlement increased in size, there is still no evidence that the legendary Troy is located on Hisarlik Hill. Ancient ruins are ubiquitous in modern Turkey. Therefore, Schliemann, who began his excavations on Hisarlik Hill, needed tangible evidence that the city he found was indeed Troy. And it was found. In May 1873, Schliemann unexpectedly found a buried treasure that he confidently declared as the treasure of the Trojan king Priam. However, the circumstances under which the treasure was found raise serious suspicions. Firstly, initially Schliemann could not even name the day when the discovery was made and only named the month, May. Could he really forget such a significant date? After all, if his biography is to be believed, he had been preparing for this day since childhood. Later he did provide a date, May 27, 1873. Secondly, Schliemann initially claimed that his wife Sophia was the only witness to the discovery of the treasure trove. But later it turned out that Mrs. Schliemann had left Turkey in early May and could not have been a witness to this historic event. Faced with this fact, Schliemann admitted that supposedly, he wanted his wife to be considered a co-discoverer. Thirdly, doubts about the authenticity of the treasure are reinforced by another extremely curious fact. It turns out that Schliemann was looking for jewelers who would make copies of the found gold jewelry. He had specific requirements for the jewelers. These people had to be knowledgeable about antiquities, not put their own mark on the copies, charge a reasonable price for the work, and most importantly, not reveal Schliemann's involvement. Schliemann explained his desire to make duplicates by stating that the Turkish government was unlikely to forget about its share of the treasures. And if half of the findings were returned, Schliemann would still have the copies. But Schliemann's entire activity is shrouded in such darkness that it is completely unclear when he was negotiating with the jewelers. Was it after the treasure was found, or before? Most likely, the treasure that he discovered alone on the hill of Hisarlik was nothing more than the work of the skilled jewelers of the 19th century. Fourthly, Schliemann's claim that he found the treasures of the legendary King Priam looked rather strange. Making such a statement was at least irresponsible. Establishing an absolute date for a gold, silver, or copper item is impossible even today. One can try to make a connection to some historical era if there are inscriptions, names, titles, or numbers on the objects. But there is not a single letter on the items found by Schliemann. And this is despite the fact that Schliemann claimed to have found 8,833 items. Most of the treasure consisted of beads, chains, buttons, clasps, and fragments of daggers. But there were also goblets made of gold, vessels, household copper and bronze utensils, 2 gold diadems, and silver flasks. Fifthly, the operation to export the supposedly found treasures from the Ottoman Empire was very suspicious. Schliemann prepared the operation plan in advance and kept it strictly secret. The treasures were packed in 6 wooden boxes and secretly transported to the house of British consul Frank Calvert, the same Frank Calvert who began excavations of the supposed Homeric Troy. Then the treasures were taken to Anit Limani harbor, located 5 kilometers north of Hisarlik. Here, the chartered ship Taxiarchus was already waiting for them. With the help of Schliemann's trusted people, the ship arrived at the island of Syros. Then the priceless cargo was transferred to another ship, which delivered it to Athens. All of this was genuine smuggling, because under the terms of the agreement between Schliemann and the Turkish government, half of all the treasures found belonged to the Ottoman Empire. But Schliemann was not going to part with the treasure. He explained the contraband transportation of the find abroad by saying that ignorant Turks would simply melt down these unique treasures. But perhaps the operation to export the treasures was just a show. Instead of Priam's treasure, Schliemann may have packed some items into the wooden boxes that were found at the site of these ruins, but did not have any special value. It is believed that in addition to the so-called treasures of Priam, Heinrich Schliemann also discovered an ancient burial site in Mycenae. There, he discovered a gold funeral mask, which he immediately declared to be the mask of another hero from the Iliad, Agamemnon. Yet again, there was no evidence to support his claim. Today, historians say that the mask belonged to another ruler whose name is not yet known. It is interesting how archaeologists were able to prove that an unknown mask belonged to an unknown ruler whose name is also unknown. To consider some of the buildings located on this site as remnants of ancient Ilion is simply absurd. For example, archaeologists ask us to believe that the city gates were once located here. And every day, year after year, heavy loaded carts entered and exited through them. But it is well known that any road used for many years will inevitably develop ruts. This is what a stone road in the city of Chufut-Calais in Crimea, which was actually used by wagons for a long time, looks like. Sure, the depth of the ruts depends on the strength of the material used, but such a road cannot remain perfectly flat. There are no ruts from wheels, no potholes left by animal hooves, no other damage that usually appears on the surface of a road. And with such a steep slope, it would be practically impossible for loaded wagons to go up and down the road. In addition, the road literally ends at a wall. It seems that no one ever traveled here, and this road is a sham remake. This is another interesting structure located on the territory of the archaeological complex. This wall clearly shows that the building is composed of several layers. Archaeologists claim that the foundation of the building was made 2,500 years before Christ. The plaque does not say when the top bricks were laid. Note that for some reason the building is covered with a canopy. When surprised tourists ask why it was done, guides answer that this way the structure is protected from rain. And indeed, the bricks are made of such fragile material that they crumble easily even from a touch. And heavy rains can turn them into a pile of mud. But how did people live in such a house? And why did they build their dwelling from such a meager material? When you carefully examine these ruins, it becomes evident that this is not actually the remains of an ancient building, but a cheap decoration, hastily made for tourists. These are fragments of an ancient burial. It is also believed to be several thousand years old. It is amazing how the ancient builders managed to so evenly cut marble blocks and stone slabs for facing the tomb. And most importantly, what did they cut them with? The quality of the finish of this supposedly ancient tomb is practically the same as that of modern buildings. All these peculiarities and contradictions gave specialists a reason to doubt the authenticity of the treasures. To this day, many serious scholars consider the discovery of Troy to be a hoax, and Schliemann himself, a daring fantasist or just a liar. But if this is really just an ordinary military fortification, why did the archaeologists organize this high-profile falsification? For fame and money? Or perhaps they acted not solely in their own interests and someone was behind them? Today it is difficult to answer this question, but for historians of the Scaliger school, this grand forgery was very opportune. And to finally convince tourists that they are on the territory of the supposedly ancient Troy, a huge wooden horse was built at the entrance to the archaeological complex, which travelers from all over the world love to climb inside. But as it turns out, the story of the Trojan horse is just another fantastic legend in a series of fictions associated with ancient Troy.
We have discovered that the Trojan War is reflected in old documents under various names, including the famous Roman-Etruscan War in the history of Rome and the famous Gothic War in the history of Byzantium and Rome. So, it turns out that in the history of the capture of Troy, according to the documents of the Gothic War, this city was taken through the old destroyed aqueduct. The troops broke into the city through the pipe of the old aqueduct. It appears that in the Homeric text, the aqueduct morphed into the Trojan horse. Why? The answer, apparently, is very simple. In Latin, water is written as aqua, and horse is written as equa. Scribes confused these two words and turned the aqueduct, which once carried water, into a horse, the Trojan horse. Thus, a fanciful image was born, which has since wandered through the pages of old chronicles.
For many years, the question of where the great Troy was located has been stirring the minds of scholars, adventurers, and even readers of Homer's poem. It was only a matter of time before someone uncovered the truth that Troy was actually medieval Constantinople. The only way to end these searches was to find some ruins on the shores of the Bosporus and declare them to be the ruins of Troy. Thanks to Schliemann, this task was successfully accomplished. and the search for the real Troy came to an end for many years. Though, gullible tourists flocked in droves to Hisarlik. Travelers from all over the world come here to see with their own eyes the city described by the great Homer. Unfortunately, the falsification of Troy is not the only case in the history of archaeology. In 50 years, a new sensation will sweep the world, which will overshadow even Schliemann's deeds. In November 1922, sensational news dominated the front pages of British newspapers. In the Egyptian Valley of the Kings, a grandiose burial was found, the tomb of the pharaoh Tutankhamun. The uniqueness of this finding was not only in the wealth of the tomb. Until then, the very figure of Tutankhamun was considered mythical. Information about this person was limited to 1 or 2 seals with his name, without any indication of his royal title. Therefore, many scholars did not consider Tutankhamun a king, at best, just a noble person. But the discovery made in November 1922 changed everything. The man who discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun became the #1 Egyptologist in the world. It was a professional archaeologist, Howard Carter. He had been working in Egypt for several years and was considered to be quite successful. But Carter was ambitious. He intended to do what no one had done before: to find the tomb of Tutankhamun himself. In 1917, he gathered an expedition and began excavations in the Valley of the Kings. By this time, all the scholars were convinced that it was impossible to find anything significant here. German archaeologist Richard Lepsius claimed that there was not a single grain of sand left in the Valley of the Kings that had not been moved at least 3 times from one place to another. By 1917, all that archaeologists had found were insignificant trinkets. And Carter, as a professional, knew this, and yet, he began his search. Today, almost 100 years later, many researchers of Egyptian antiquities suggest that Carter's discovery was not a grandiose discovery, but a grandiose hoax. For 10 years, Carter was not engaged in the search and subsequent study of the tomb of Tutankhamun, but in falsification. This is not surprising, as the burial looks more like a decoration than a tomb. And a number of circumstances that accompanied his work still raise many questions. Circumstance 1. Carter began excavations at the very spot where the tomb would later be found. However, at first, Carter allegedly found nothing there. Therefore, over the next 5 years, he meticulously meter by meter searched other areas of the Valley of the Kings. In 1922, Carter decided to return to the spot where the search had begun and immediately found the burial site. Circumstance 2. After discovering the tomb, Carter did not allow his colleagues to open the sealed doors and intentionally delayed the excavation process. He forced members of the expedition to study the already made findings, although it would have been better to do this under laboratory conditions, rather than on site. Furthermore, Carter ordered to bury the tomb and wait for the expedition sponsor, Lord Carnarvon, to arrive. Such behavior is quite strange for an archaeologist. Circumstance 3. When the archaeologists excavated the tomb again, they found that the sealed entrance had already been opened and resealed twice before. The conclusion was obvious. The tomb had been visited by thieves twice. However, when the expedition members managed to enter the tomb, they saw a large number of objects, including many precious items. At this point, Carter made a strange decision. Instead of continuing to investigate the tomb, he ordered it to be resealed and left for Cairo. It was only in late December 1922 that the first discovery was extracted from the tomb. Carter entered the room containing the pharaoh's sarcophagus only in February 1923. It turned out that this room, filled with golden objects, had not been plundered either. No one could explain why the thieves who had visited the tomb did not take anything. Why didn't they open the gold-plated wooden sarcophagus after breaking into the burial chamber? All finds were in excellent condition. The golden objects sparkled like new. They had not gathered dust or become tarnished in 3,000 years. But it was not the only thing that looked strange.
In the tomb, gold coins were found, sealed in leather pouches. These leather pouches, in any case, should have rotted in 3,000 years, but they were intact. Moreover, traces of modern tools were found on many items, including saw marks. As is known, 3,000 years ago was the Bronze Age. At that time, the Egyptians did not have metal. It is doubtful that anything could have been made with bronze saws. Such a tool hardly existed, and in the tomb was a royal chariot that could not go through the door. It simply could not be brought in. It was sawn apart.
The fourth circumstance. For some reason, a narrow-gauge railway was laid to the burial site of Tutankhamun. The fifth circumstance. Surprisingly, it took an unusually long time to work in the tomb. The excavations lasted for 5 long years. Was it really necessary to spend so much time on inventorying the treasures, sarcophagi, and mummy that were located in an 80-square-meter area? The sixth circumstance. The burial is significantly different from other tombs located in the Valley of the Kings. In all the tombs, the vaulted ceilings are oval in shape. But Tutankhamun's burial chamber is in the form of a regular parallelepiped. All the corners here are right angles. An attentive observer will be struck by the paintings in the tomb. In all available photographs, it is deliberately taken so as to give the impression that the painting covers all the walls. This is probably because this is how other tombs in the Valley of the Kings are painted. In some of them, the painting is even done on the ceiling. But in Tutankhamun's tomb, the painting only covers the walls of the burial chamber. Moreover, the main image is right in front of the eyes of those entering the tomb. Where it is inconvenient to look, for some reason there are no paintings. One gets the impression that it was depicted specifically for tourists. There is nothing like this in other tombs. But the most interesting thing is that in the photographs that can be seen in various publications, the painting looks like it is made of gold, and it looks very old. It can be seen that many fragments have decayed or fallen off. But in reality, this painting was done with a simple yellow gold paint. And the supposedly lost fragments are just strokes of dark brown paint. In other words, this painting was originally made to look old and cannot be an authentic ancient image. Seventh circumstance. The extremely poor condition of the mummy found in the tomb is noteworthy. The so-called mummy of Tutankhamun has survived in much worse condition than the mummies of other pharaohs. Eighth circumstance. Tutankhamun's tomb is the only one in the Valley of the Kings where tourists are strictly forbidden not only to film videos but also to take pictures. At the entrance, video and photo cameras are simply taken away. Most likely, the real tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun never existed. The so-called excavations in the Valley of the Kings, which Carter began in the fall of 1917, were just a red herring. In reality, Carter was not looking for Tutankhamun's tomb, but building it. However, it takes time to dig up a tomb and fill it with countless treasures. Therefore, his expedition spent 5 years shoveling sand in the Egyptian desert from one place to another. After 5 years, the production of the fakes was completed, and along with authentic artifacts, they began to be transported to the tomb by narrow-gauge railway. When the burial chamber was filled, Carter returned to the site and almost immediately discovered the entrance to the tomb. The entrance, which had been opened and then sealed twice, was explained by the intrusion of strange ancient robbers who, upon entering the tomb, took nothing. However, in order to produce such a large quantity of gold items, a colossal amount of money was needed. It is unlikely that the expedition sponsor, Lord Carnarvon, could have paid for all of it on his own. Most likely, Carter received help from the Egyptian government, and the archaeological forgery turned into a very profitable business project. Only a small part of the alleged treasures of Tutankhamun is kept in Cairo. Most of it was sold to various museums around the world for astronomical sums of money. So, if the Egyptian government lent Carter a certain amount of money, they more than recovered it. Not to mention the crowds of tourists who come to the banks of the Nile every year to see the tomb of Tutankhamun first and foremost. But why didn't any of the members of the expedition ever speak out about Carter's forgery? Did no one notice anything? And here the so-called curse of the pharaoh immediately comes to mind, which supposedly caused the deaths of many members of Carter's expedition. Lord Carnarvon was the first to die. This happened in 1923. The Lord supposedly died of blood poisoning after careless shaving. A little later, Lady Carnarvon died from a mosquito bite. Then the deaths followed one after another. Suddenly departed this life Archibald Reed, who conducted the X-ray analysis of Tutankhamun's mummy; Mace, who opened the burial chamber together with Carter; Carter's secretary, young Lord Westbury; his father, Senior Lord Westbury; and Carnarvon's half-brother, Aubrey Herbert, who committed suicide. By 1930, only Howard Carter himself remained alive among the immediate participants of the expedition. The succession of these deaths gave rise to a lot of speculation. Various versions were discussed, from heavenly retribution that befell tomb raiders, to pathogenic bacteria that ancient Egyptian priests supposedly deliberately placed in the tomb. But none of the suggested hypotheses found scientific confirmation. Therefore, to this day, the most likely explanation is that the deaths of archaeologists, which followed one after another, were simply a monstrous coincidence. However, it cannot be ruled out that both Carter's colleagues and Lord Carnarvon himself simply began to doubt the authenticity of the findings. That is why they had to be eliminated. After all, the so-called curse of the pharaoh did not befall all members of the expedition, only those who either visited the tomb or worked with the pharaoh's mummy.
Many participants and scientists who worked with Carter and were not involved in this entire affair suspected that they were not dealing with a genuine burial. The first to suspect were those who conducted X-rays of the mummy. The Egyptian intelligence agencies had no choice but to quietly eliminate these people. Therefore, in my opinion, such an explanation may be logical. It is probably possible to confirm it with some kind of data, but so far it is not available, naturally.
Of course, the versions of the violent deaths of the expedition members do not have irrefutable evidence. But too many strange circumstances and coincidences were associated with both the tomb of Tutankhamun and Carter himself, who safely lived until 1939 and died at home in his bed at the age of 65, from natural causes.
When archaeologists retrieve their sensational finds, made surprisingly in modern times, they often pseudo-confirm the reality of completely mythical things. The question arises, what does history turn into in connection with this? Alongside entirely real people, completely mythical characters begin to coexist. Egyptology is no exception in this sense.
Falsification of historical facts is also found in the history of Asian countries, for example, in the history of China. This unique structure, resembling the body of a long dragon, is the famous Great Wall of China. It stretches across all of China, with a length of more than 6,400 kilometers, a height that reaches 7 meters, and a thickness of 3 meters. It is believed that the construction of the wall began in the 3rd century BC and was completed in the 17th century AD. That is, according to the historical version accepted today, this construction lasted almost 2,000 years. Truly a unique structure. History does not know another back-burner construction project like this. Everyone has become so accustomed to this historical version that few people question its absurdity. Any construction project, especially a large one, has a certain practical purpose. Who today would even think of starting a huge construction project that could only be completed in 2,000 years? Obviously, no one, because it would be meaningless. Not only would this endless construction project place a heavy burden on the country's population, but the construction itself would constantly be destroyed and would have to be rebuilt. This is what happened with the Great Wall of China. We will never know what the first sections of the wall, allegedly built before the Common Era, looked like. They, for sure, have collapsed. And the sections that have survived to our time were mostly built during the Ming Dynasty, supposedly from the 14th to the 17th century AD. This is because in that era, the main building materials were brick and stone blocks, which made the structure more durable. So historians are still forced to admit that this wall, which anyone can see today, appeared no earlier than the 14th century AD. But even 600 years is a very respectable age for a stone construction. It is still unclear why this structure has been so well preserved. In Europe, for example, medieval stone fortifications aged and fell apart over time. They had to be dismantled and new, more modern ones built. The same thing happened in Russia. Many medieval military fortifications were rebuilt in the 17th century. But in China, these natural physical laws somehow did not apply. But even if we assume that ancient Chinese builders possessed some kind of secret that allowed them to create such a unique structure, historians have no logical answer to the most important question. Why did the Chinese build a stone wall with such persistence for 2,000 years? Who did they want to defend against? Historians answer, the wall was built along the entire border of the Chinese Empire to protect against nomadic raids. But the nomads of that time had arrows and spears with copper and even stone tips. Against such weapons, a 3-meter thick stone wall was not necessary. Russians and Europeans began building similar structures only when cannons and siege weapons appeared on the battlefields. That is, in the 15th century. But the issue is not even the thickness of the wall, but its length. A wall stretching for thousands of kilometers could not protect China from raids. And here's why. Firstly, in many places, it runs at the foot of nearby hills, as here, for example. It is obvious that the enemy, having climbed the neighboring peaks, could easily shoot all the defenders on this stretch of the wall. Chinese soldiers would have nowhere to hide from the arrows flying from above. Secondly, watchtowers were built every 60 to 100 meters along the entire length of the wall. Large military units were supposed to be constantly stationed in these towers and monitor for the appearance of the enemy. But already in the 3rd century BC, during the reign of Emperor Shi Huang, when 4,000 kilometers of the wall had already been built, it was found out that if the towers were installed so often, it would be impossible to ensure an effective defense of the wall. All the armed forces of the Chinese Empire would not be sufficient. And if a small detachment is put on each tower, it will become easy prey for the enemy. A small detachment will be eliminated before neighboring units can come to its aid. If defensive units are made larger but installed less frequently, then unprotected sections of the wall that are too long will be formed, through which the enemy will easily penetrate deep into the country. It is not surprising that the construction of such a fortification did not protect China from raids. However, its construction greatly depleted the state and the Qin dynasty lost the throne. The new Han dynasty was not counting on the Great Wall and returned to a system of maneuver warfare. But still, as historians claim, the construction of the wall continued for some reason. A strange story. An interesting fact is that until the end of the 17th century, besides the Great Wall, no large stone structures had been built in China. And yet, scholars claim that the population of China engaged in constant civil wars. Why didn't they fortify themselves with walls or build stone citadels in their cities? With such unique experience in building the Great Wall, the entire country could have been covered with defensive structures. It turns out that all of China's resources, efforts, and talents were spent only on building the Great Wall, which was, in general, useless from a military point of view. But there is another historical version of the construction of the Great Wall of China. This version is not as popular among historians as the first one, but it is more logical. The Great Wall was indeed built along the border of China, but not for protection from nomads, but as a demarcation line between two states. And its construction began not 2,000 years ago, but much later, in the 17th century AD, so the famous wall is no more than 300 years old. An interesting historical fact supports this version. According to the official historical version, by the mid-17th century, the northern lands of China, that is, those lands bordering Russia, were severely depopulated. To protect these territories from settlement by Russians, Mongols, and Koreans, in 1678, Emperor Kangxi ordered this border of the empire to be surrounded by a special fortified line. Its construction continued until the end of the 1680s. One might ask why the emperor needed to build a new fortified line if there was already a huge stone wall along the entire northern border of China. Most likely, there was no such wall there yet. Therefore, to protect their lands, the Chinese began building a line of fortifications. After all, it was during this time that China was engaged in border wars with Russia. And only at the end of the 17th century did the Russians and the Chinese agree on where the border between the two states would be. In 1689, the Russo-Chinese Treaty was signed in Nerchinsk, which fixed the northern border of China. Presumably, the Chinese rulers of the 17th century attached great importance to the Treaty of Nerchinsk. Therefore, they decided to mark the border not only on paper but also on the ground. Thus a border wall appeared along the entire border with Russia. This is an 18th century map of Asia made by the Royal Academy in Amsterdam. Here, two states, China and Tartary, are clearly visible. The northern border of China runs approximately along the 40th parallel. The Great Wall of China also runs precisely along the border. Moreover, it is marked with a bold line and the inscription, Muraille de la Chine, which means the Wall of China in French. The same can be seen on the map of Asia issued in 1754. Here, the Great Wall also runs approximately along the border between China and Tartary. The wall is also depicted on the map of Tartary by Guillaume de Lille. It is clearly visible that this is not just a bold line, but a wall with towers. And this is a large Gottorp globe that is stored in the Kunstkamera in St. Petersburg. It also clearly shows an image of the wall, which marks the border between China and the neighboring state of Chinese Tartary. Overall, this is a unique case in cartography where an architectural structure is depicted on a geographical map. Certainly, one could assume that ancient Chinese people as early as 2,000 years ago predicted where the Russo-Chinese border would be located. And in 1689, without any trickery, the two countries simply established the border along the already existing wall. But if that were the case, it would have been mentioned in the treaty. However, there is no mention of the wall in the Treaty of Nerchinsk. For several decades, scientists around the world have been ringing the alarm bell. One of the 7 wonders of the world, the Great Wall of China, is rapidly deteriorating. Indeed, in some places, the height of the wall has decreased to 2 meters. Watchtowers have completely disappeared in some areas. Several tens of kilometers of the wall have been completely lost, and hundreds of kilometers continue to rapidly deteriorate. And this is despite the fact that over the past few centuries, the wall has been repeatedly repaired and restored. So why wasn't it collapsing at such a fast pace before? Why, after standing for over 2,000 years, is it suddenly turning into ruins? Scientists blame the climate, ecology, agriculture, and, for sure, tourists. Every year, 10 million people visit the wall, climbing where they can and cannot. They want to see even the sections of the wall that are closed to visitors. But the reason for its deterioration is probably different. The Great Wall of China is deteriorating in a perfectly natural way, like all similar structures. 300 years is a very respectable age for a stone structure. And the idea that this great Chinese long-term construction project is 2,000 years old is a myth, like much of China's own history. However, in ancient China, there likely was a fortification that was called a wall. Its fragments can still be found near the modern-day Great Wall of China.
When I visited the Great Wall of China in early 2010, specifically the wall that is presented as the ancient Great Wall of China, I fortunately brought a strong pair of binoculars with me. And as I surveyed the area in front of this wall, I saw that the Chinese wall really existed. It was visible through the binoculars. This wall does not run along mountain peaks like the fake wall that is shown to tourists, which I walked on. It was clear to me that I was walking on a fake wall. But the wall that I saw through the binoculars left an impression of being a truly ancient, old wall.
Unfortunately, this wall is almost completely destroyed. However, in photographs taken by Gleb Nozovsky, it is clear that it runs along a plain. It can be seen that the wall was not made of stone, but of rammed earth. Judging by the fragments of towers that have survived on the wall, it truly had a military, frontier purpose. But despite the fact that this ancient structure is located quite close to the modern wall, Chinese historians pretend that the ancient fortification simply does not exist.
Several graduate students, historians from Peking University, accompanied me. When I showed them this wall through binoculars, they just exclaimed and gestured. They had never heard of it before. I asked them if it was possible to go there, to this wall. I received a clear and confident answer. No, it's not possible.
Myths about the past of peoples and the authenticity of historical monuments arose in times when people had a very vague idea even about life in neighboring cities, let alone distant countries and continents. Therefore, any tall tale told by a passing traveler was taken at face value by people. Today we have access to a huge amount of historical information. We have the opportunity to see the world and verify the truthfulness of this information. Therefore, while inspecting ancient cities and modern museums, climbing ruins and descending into tombs, we must look at the world with our own eyes, not just through the eyes of tour guides. After all, the more carefully we treat history, the less room there will be for fabrication and forgery. The results of the scientific project New Chronology allow us to speak about the fact that Russian history has suffered the most from the activities of falsifiers. Unlike other states, Russia's past was distorted beyond recognition. By order of the reformers of the 17th and 18th centuries, many historical facts were completely rewritten, and some even disappeared from the pages of Russian history. One of the vivid examples of historical falsification is the era of the 16th century. Historians not only invented a new interpretation of the political events of that time, but also completely distorted the biographies of the rulers of the Rurik dynasty. See our next film, Ivan the Terrible, to learn who really ruled under the name of Ivan IV.